For this one, we're asked to graph the cosine of x. All right, so on this one, remember that cosine are all of our x values. So if I were to go cosine of 90 degrees, for instance, it would be 0. Cosine of 60 degrees, my x value would be 1/2. So cosine of 60 degrees is 1/2. All right, so let's kind of just look at what this graph's going to look like. At 0 here, my x value is 1. So here we go. I put it right at 1. At pi halves, my x value is 0. So I'm going to put it right here at 0. At pi, when I go all the way over here, my x value is -1. At 3 pi halves, my x value is 0. And then at 2 pi, my x value is back up to 1. So I'm going to just try to graph this as best I can do with the computer, so don't judge me on that. But all right, now that we've got that, let's look at if we can change this graph at all. If I took this graph, this would be y equals 2 times cosine of x. So we know what cosine of x is. We just graphed that one. Now all we're going to do is multiply all of these values by 2. Okay, so instead of it being 1 times 2 is 2. So I'm going to put my first dot right there. Instead of it being at, let's see, pi halves is at 0. 0 times 2 is still 0. So I put a dot right there. Okay, at pi, I was at -1. But I go -1 times 2 would be -2. 3 pi halves was at 0 times 2 would still be 0. And at 2 pi, I was at 1 times 2 would give me 2. So I'm going to go ahead and graph this one here. So it's the exact same graph. I just basically stretched it by a magnitude of 2, right? It's been, we take cosine of x and multiply it by 2. What if I could do y equals 2 cosine of x minus 1? Okay, so we already know what 2 cosine of x is. Here we go. So I can graph that one. Now this one, I've scaled it differently because this one goes to 4 instead of 2. So, but it's the exact same graph here. The only difference is now I'm going to -1. So I take and subtract 1 from each one of these. Instead of this one being at 2, it's going to be at 1. Instead of this one being at -2, it'll be at -3. I take and I slide that whole graph down -1 units. Okay, so that's my new graph there. Now let's look at this one. This is y equals 1/2 cosine of x plus 1. Okay, so I'm going to do this one, but instead of worrying about this plus 1, I like to just graph this part first, and then I'll do the plus 1 later. So this is cosine of x, 1/2 of cosine of x. So instead of being at 1, we would be at 1/2. Okay, and instead of being at pi halves, let's see, we're at 0. 0 times 1/2, well, that's still 0. I didn't change anything. So then at pi, I was at -1, and I want half of that, so that's going to be -1/2. 3 pi over 2, I was at 0 times 1/2 is still 0. 2 pi was at 1 times 1/2 is now at 1/2. So I'm going to graph that one real quick here. Now, here's a crazy thing. Now, this is the graph of 1/2 cosine of x. I still have to deal with this plus 1. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift this entire graph up 1 unit. So there's 1/2 of a unit, there's 1 full unit. I take and I just move that whole thing up 1 full unit, and that is my graph of 1/2 cosine of x plus 1. I just took and moved the whole thing up 1 unit. So hopefully you found that helpful.